I used to quip that whenever people were looking to show off a weird animal you might not have heard of, it seemed like a 50-50 shot that they'd go for the pangolin. And it makes sense. Pangolins are extremely weird-looking animals that have historically been little known in the English-speaking world, or at least in English-speaking North America. That obviously changed in 2020, with the event I don't think I can name without getting fact-shamed by YouTube, when the official story for said event was transmission from bats to pangolins to humans in Chinese wet markets. So at this point, I imagine most English-speaking North Americans have at least heard of pangolins, or at least when I use speech-to-text it no longer writes penguin every time I say pangolin. However, odds are that you still don't know a lot about this group of animals. So join me as I make a figurine of the African Ground Pangolin, and I talk about the ground pangolin and its 7 closest relatives, as well as depictions of pangolins in folk art, crafts, and toys. Hello, and welcome to EdGooby, where I make arts and crafts of animals that are evolutionarily distinct, biogeographically unusual, and or behaviorally interesting. I will be making my pangolin, or rather, thanks to the magic of editing, I already made it back in early 2023, out of air-dry clay, and painting it with acrylic paint. As you can see, I have already prototyped it in non-drying plasticine modeling clay. I don't currently show my prototyping process, because I have a hard time simultaneously being creative and making sure that what I'm doing is in frame. But if I ever get to the point I can hire help with filming, I will totally show that too. I will start by rolling the body out and shaping the pointy head and flat tail. I am making the body from head to tail out of a single piece, and then later adding the limbs as 4 separate pieces. It is different sculpting with different varieties of clay, different working with plasticine modeling clay versus air-dry clay versus ceramic clay, and different working with different kinds of air-dry clay as well. I experimented with several varieties of air-dry clay, as I will talk about in the next video, and settled on what I believe is a mineral clay, or at least it feels like a proper ceramic clay, except that it dries considerably quicker, and has a much greater tendency towards cracking. The cracking is particularly an issue if I try to pull elongated sections out of a main body, as I tend to do with the plasticine modeling clay. The upshot, however, is that it is relatively easy to stick additional pieces on with water and a little bit of pressure. That is less effective with plasticine clay, and with proper ceramic clay I would need to score the joins and apply slip. But here I can just put a little bit of water on each side of the join point and press and massage them together. Of course, air-dry clay can still have cracking issues, as you will see later in the video. But for now, let's talk about why I find pangolins so interesting. And let's start with the most obvious feature of pangolins, their scales, which are entirely unlike anything else found on mammals. Even so, I was expecting that I was going to say that these are basically modified hair follicles like with porcupine quills, and leave it at that. However, as I dug into the specifics, I found myself going down a rabbit hole. This started when I learned that, as best I can determine, while pangolin scales use the same genetic and developmental pathways as hair follicles, they do not develop from the hair follicles as porcupine quills do. That is to say that the alterations that produced pangolin scales appear to occur at an earlier stage of development, making them more analogous to the feathers of birds, perhaps? However, like the hair or nails, they do keep growing throughout the life of the pangolin. This led me to wonder whether there are any mammals with spines or quills that develop in the same way as pangolin scales, to which the short answer appears to be no. All of the 7 independent evolutions of spines or quills we know of in mammals appear to be modified hair follicles. Actually, when I started this video, I was thinking it was 5 independent evolutions of quills or spines: hedgehogs, echidnas, tenrecs, and the 2 lineages of Old and New World porcupines. The 7th lineage is yet another rodent, the spiny mice. But the 6th lineage I found when I discovered that genetic evidence suggests that spines in tenrecs evolved independently twice in 2 closely related lineages. This is similar to how gliding appears to have evolved 3 times in the possums of Australia, and that is something that I definitely want to talk about in future videos. As I said in my first video on the groove building, when something evolves multiple times in closely related animals, that suggests something in the lineage is pre-adapted for it. But this is not a video about gliding possums or even tenrec spines. It's a video about pangolins and their strange scales. And in a chapter from McGill Bioengineering, Barrett Vaness et al. Observed that pangolins are missing various genes associated with immunity. The authors speculated that pangolin scales evolved to minimize the risk of injuries that could lead to infections. My personal instinct, looking at other cases where genes like this were lost, is that either they were lost when the group no longer needed these genes, as with the ability of monkeys to synthesize vitamin C, or more likely, pangolins traded off some aspect of the immune system for benefits elsewhere, as with bats reducing their inflammatory response and compensating with their antiviral abilities. The authors of this same chapter also go into a great deal of detail about the biomechanical aspects of pangolin scales. One of these properties is that the ridges on the scales, in addition to lending structural support, reduce friction, and this property has inspired experiments with microgrooves on surgical instruments, which have also been found to reduce friction. I don't know if this will make any major changes to medical science, but it's certainly neat. You will see that I am indicating the scales of the pangolin in two different ways. The smaller scales towards its head, I'm using a tool to make semicircular indentations. The larger scales on its body, as well as the smaller scales on the tail, I am cross-hatching in a diamond pattern. But anyways, back on the subject of convergent evolution, animals that could be called anteaters have evolved at least 5 separate times that we know of. I say at least, firstly because armadillos are a weird intermediate case, and secondly because there are bones of an extinct animal from Madagascar called the Bibi malagasy, which was once thought to be related to aardvarks, but went extinct recently enough that we could study its genetics and determine that it is related to tenrecs. Adaptations to this very specialized niche of what scientists call myrmecophagy or termitophagy, specialized feeding on ants and termites, include long jaws that lose their teeth, long tongues to get deep into nests, and strong forelimbs for tearing into ant and termite nests. The long snouts of anteatery animals seem to be to help give the tongue a head start in getting into the nest, and often end up fused into a tube so that the animal cannot open its mouth. The really interesting thing to me about the convergent evolution of anteater-like animals is that it has happened at least 5 times, at least once in each of what I would think of as the 5 major groups of mammals, if I had to divide mammals into 5 major groups. 3 of these are historically called anteaters in English. In addition to the anteaters proper, you have the echidnas or spiny anteaters, and the scaly anteaters or pangolins. The other 2 are the numbat and aardvark, which are each the only species in their entire families, making them 2 extremely evolutionarily distinct animals. Indeed, the London Zoo gives the aardvark the highest evolutionary distinctiveness score of any mammal. Anyways, the echidnas are monotremes, the numbat is a marsupial, aardvarks belong to the Afrotherians, which as the name suggests are a lineage of placental mammals that historically developed in Africa. Anteaters proper belong to a distinct South American group of placentals called the Xenarthrans, and pangolins are part of the Laurasiatherians, the group which includes the vast majority of placental mammals today. Pangolins were actually thought to be Xenarthrans themselves, until genetic studies showed that their closest relatives are seals? Well, the carnivorans in general. Carnivorans and pangolins are sister taxa, each other's closest relatives, among living species today. However, while there are almost 300 species of carnivorans grouped into 16 families, which include animals as diverse as seals and bears and foxes and lions, there are only 8 species of pangolins, which all look and live remarkably similarly and are grouped into a single family. So anyways, if you divide the living mammals into 5 major groups, each major lineage has its very own anteater. Mind you, I usually divide the mammals into 6 major groups, and our own lineage has no anteater, but we do have 3 of the 6 times gliding evolved in mammals, 4 out of 7 if you count the edge case of Shafaka lemurs, so that's cool. Of course, the lineage that includes pangolins also has the bats, full-on flying mammals, but our lineage has us, so I'll call that a draw. Internal pangolin phylogeny itself is pretty neat as well. There are 8 species, split neatly into African and Asian clades of 4 species each. The phylogeny of the Asian pangolins, which form one of the 3 subfamilies of the pangolin family, demonstrate some facets of biogeography pretty neatly. The most divergent species among the Asian pangolins is the Chinese pangolin, and central and southern China is in a weird place biogeographically, with Holt putting it in its own kingdom with Japan, and Moroni calling it a transition zone between the Palearctic and Indo-Malay kingdoms. The next most divergent species is the Indian pangolin, and a lot of Indo-Malay groups show clear divisions between India and Southeast Asia. The 2 most closely related of the Asian pangolin species are the Sunda and Philippines pangolins. The Sunda pangolin is found across a broad stretch of Southeast Asia, which would have been one landmass in the last ice age, while the Philippines pangolin is endemic to the island of Palawan, which tends to be closer to Borneo than to the rest of the Philippines in terms of its plants and animals, but frequently has its own distinct species as well. The African pangolins in turn divide again into two subfamilies each containing a single genus, with each genus containing two species, the African Ground Pangolins and the African Tree Pangolins. When picking a pangolin to make as a figurine, I chose the ground pangolins over the tree pangolins for three reasons. One is that it's easier to make figurines that stand on flat surfaces than those that are intended to perch on the edges of things. One has to do with something that the two species of ground pangolin illustrate about biogeography, which I will get to in a moment. And the last has to do with yet another example of the pangolins, or at least these two species of ground pangolin in the genus Smutsia, showing a remarkable evolutionary convergence. The convergence I am speaking of? Walking on 2 feet as the primary means of locomotion. Most bipedal mammals, that is to say most mammals that stand on 2 feet, move about by hopping. As far as I know, there are only 3 living species of mammals which walk on 2 feet, the 2 terrestrial African pangolins, and 1 very weird African monkey, which has since gone on to conquer the world. I do have to specify living species here, because several recently extinct ground sloths have skeletal structures that suggest they had a bipedal walking gait as well. But anyways, how did I decide to call the sculpture I am making a ground pangolin rather than a giant pangolin? It could very well be either after all. I am not at the skill level where I can distinguish them in my crafts. I was very much on the fence. After all, the giant pangolin is the largest pangolin out there, and I may even have used it as a reference when I shot this footage of me making this figurine back in early 2023. The reason I decided to go with the ground pangolin is because these two species demonstrate something interesting about African biogeography. The giant pangolin, you'll notice, lives in the rainforest climates of Central and Western Africa, where it overlaps with the 2 species of African tree pangolin, the white-bellied tree pangolin and the black-bellied tree pangolin. The ground pangolin, by contrast, is the only pangolin found in the drier parts of Africa, and it displays a common distribution among African mammals, in which it can be found in dry areas from the Sahel to the Kalahari, but loops around the wet zones. This is why Wallace's original biogeography of the Afrotropic Kingdom divided into 4 main areas. 2 of these are the Cape region of South Africa and Madagascar, both of which are very distinctive. The other 2 are basically just the wet and dry regions of tropical Africa south of the Sahara, and the 2 ground pangolin species, while not perfect, demonstrate this pretty nicely. But the ground pangolin is the only species in its range, and so that's what I'll be going for with this figurine. But anyways, the goal of this channel is to combine my interest in folk arts and crafts with my interest in animals and natural history. So excluding stamps and old scientific drawings, can we find art, crafts, or toys featuring pangolins? I already know the answer is a yes. I've known about pangolins since I was a toddler, because I had a plastic one that made me look up what they were. Today I use stuffed animals as decor, when I can find ones of species I find particularly interesting, and so I have this plush pangolin from Wild Republic that usually sits on top of one of my bookshelves. I also have this pangolin tea pet from China, which is obviously mass-produced and not a toy, but I bought it because pangolin tea pet! One of my special interests is tea, and while I don't really use tea pets, I do have a bit of a collection of them. I also bought, back when I was making the first version of this video, this cool 3D printed articulated pangolin from ReflectionsOnEarth on Etsy. I think back then, this was the only fully articulated 3D printed pangolin I found on Etsy, but now there are quite a few Etsy shops selling 3D printed movable pangolins. At the time, I remember this shop, which now seems to be defunct, sold only a handful of products, all focused around pangolin conservation. This is the first time I am talking about an endangered species on this channel, and so I think I should acknowledge that every single species of pangolin is endangered, with 3 of the Asian species being critically endangered. The final pangolin I have myself is this little alebrije from Mexican artist Claudio Ojeda on Navica, a folk arts and crafts marketplace based in San Antonio. Actually, this was one of the very first pieces I ever bought on Navica. So far as I know, this is the only pangolin that's ever been sold on Navica, or at least, every few months I used to put certain animals into the Navica search bar, pangolin among them, and I don't think I ever saw anything else. It's not currently available on the site now, but it's still listed, which suggests the artist is probably open to making more of them in the future. I noticed with an Etsy search for pangolin, that Etsy has not done nearly as good a job cleaning up people drop shipping from China or selling AI slop as I initially thought they had, but I still found more than a few interesting things I am very confident are neither, such that I can only actually show a handful of the most interesting. I will start with this felt ornament from Gypsy Raggles in Utah. The amount of little pieces that she had to cut and sew for this boggles my mind, given that she is selling it for only $18. Next up, we have a needle-felted pangolin from Irina of Angel's Workshop UA in Ukraine. I am very impressed by the detail here as well. I actually have multiple needle-felted birds from a different seller in Ukraine, Birdland Gifts. I am planning on showing off the absolute pride of my collection, which she made as a commission, on my video on Turacos. But for now I will tantalize you with this little Hawaiian iiwi honeycreeper. Next up, we have this t-shirt from Scatterbrain Tees, again in Utah, with a pattern that describes itself as an optical illusion. I'm not sure if it quite is, but it's definitely very much in the spirit of Escher. He is best known for his optical illusions, but only a few of his prints have actually featured true optical illusions. Next we have this bronze gold weight from a seller in Texas. I myself actually have one of these little bronze weights that were used by the Akan peoples of Ghana in medieval times for measuring gold, and mine is of a sawfish, another small group of very endangered animals. Indeed, not just endangered. Both pangolins and sawfish are edge species as well. And what are edge species? This is a concept developed by the London Zoo as part of its Edge Species for Evolutionarily Distinct and Globally Endangered Conservation Initiative, combining the IUCN Global Endangerment Rankings with their own statistical method for calculating evolutionary distinctiveness. 4 of their top 100 edge mammal scores are held by pangolins, and in their site redesign they've moved 2 of the most endangered pangolins to the very top of their mammal page. The sawfishes, meanwhile, a very strange group of rays, top both the London Zoo's evolutionary distinctiveness for the cartilaginous fish and their edge calculations. I imagine that there is a sawfish in this channel's future at some point as well. Anyways, back to the pangolin gold weight. The head and shape of the scales have me questioning whether this is actually a pangolin and not a porcupine or a spiny mouse, both of which also live in West Africa. But the forelimbs do seem pangolin-like and they are iconic animals, so I will take the word of the seller. Finally, we have this serpentine pangolin from Zimbabwe. I feature it not just because it's rare to see folk art from Southern Africa, even though Southern Africa definitely has a distinct folk art tradition, but also because it appears to be the exact species I am making in this video, a ground pangolin. It is in a bipedal pose, which means that it needs to belong to the genus Smutsia, and only the ground pangolin of those 2 species is found in Zimbabwe. I was actually not expecting to find any art that was unambiguously of the exact animal I'm making, and yet I did. And I realized, as I was photographing my plush pangolin, as I was editing together this video, that too is likely a ground pangolin. It is bipedal and has the short, broad tail of the Smutsia African Ground Pangolins, and since reference photos of ground pangolins are much easier to come by than those of giant pangolins, which are rather rare, I am reasonably confident that it was modeled after a ground pangolin. So anyways, let's get back to the ground pangolin I'm making, because it's time to paint. For the most part, I plan on having the conceit of using the time between sculpting and painting to talk about folk art of the animal as if the video is in real time, while the clay is drying. But for this figurine alone, that would be woefully implausible. My first 2 videos I did and filmed the sculpting and painting both in February of 2023, although I also made new footage for both which I incorporated into those videos. This one is entirely February 2023 footage for the sculpture, but then I did not paint it until October of 2025. I actually painted this pangolin only after I already had the rough draft of my first video up, and only a day or 2 before I released the final version. That is quite a gap. And speaking of gaps, plasticine modeling clay and air dry clay are 2 very different materials to work with. Actually, there are a couple of different kinds of air dry clay, which are different to work with from each other, but I will talk about that in my next video. One of the differences between the kind of air dry clay I am using and plasticine clay is that plasticine clay is less prone to drooping. As you will see when I get to the painting part, this actually proved a problem, since while it was drying, my pangolin fell forward a bit and cracked the back legs. I have since learned to prop up air dry clay models with plasticine while drying. In 24 hours, they are dry enough that I can take away the props, although I try to generally give 48 hours given how humid the climate in Houston is, before I actually paint them. I decided I was going to use some metallic acrylic paints that I bought and never used, Not because the pangolins are actually particularly shiny, but just because it's a kind of suit of armor situation. However, it's been literally years since I last painted a figurine, and I poured out way too much paint. I used the same session to get footage of me painting the next two animals with those same paint colors as well, and it still looked like I had barely made a dent in the paint I poured. I'm trying to make the middle of the scales burgundy and the edges gold. You'll see that I experiment first with painting the edges, then decide to paint the whole body burgundy, then later paint gold around the edges, before going back and touching up with burgundy again. I also use the copper's color and espresso on the head and feet, and use the burgundy paint to outline the nails of the feet, and to paint the eyes. Anyways, there you have it, my little figurine of a ground pangolin. Since I literally have a ceramic teapot of a pangolin, I definitely cannot say that I am the first person ever to make a clay sculpture or figurine of a pangolin, and while my teapot was almost certainly mass-produced, someone still had to design it. Likewise, the serpentine sculpture and my own plush pangolin make it clear that other sculptures of ground pangolins exist. I might in fact be the first person to model a ground pangolin in clay, but I certainly would not bet on it. My own inexperience with air-dry clay resulted in the model cracking, but despite what I initially thought, it actually still balances on its two back feet by default, holding its front feet out in front of it. At some point, I'm almost certainly going to give this species another attempt, using the technique I have developed of plasticine props to produce a properly postured pangolin. However, I decided that I wanted to still use the original footage and original model in order to show off the pitfalls of learning new media. Anyways, that's all for today. So if you liked the video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I hope to see y'all in the next one.